Hello, it's Dave. Got a game here for us. So it's be an English opening. This game was played between Mikhail Botvinnik and Erno Garibin. This was played in Budapest in 1952. I believe this was a team match between the USSR and Hungary. So let's get started here. Oh, by the way, our themes will be creating outposts, good knight play, and active pieces. And also, I won't be looking at any variations in this game. It'll be strictly just the ideas behind the moves. So let's get started. White is Botvinnik. He plays c4, the English opening. Black plays e6, knight to f3, knight to f6, g3, d5, bishop to g2, d takes c4, queen to a4 check, queen to d7, blocking the check, and queen takes c4. White has recovered his pawn. Next move by black is queen to c6, offering the exchange of queens. White declines and plays b3. And now black plays queen takes c4 and white plays b takes c4. Now let's take a moment and look what's happened so far. There's been an exchange of pawns. White has in reality has exchanged his b pawn for black's d pawn. And in effect, by doing so, these exchanges, white has an extra central pawn over black. Black is, like I said, has exchanged his d pawn for white's b pawn, and by having the extra pawn in the center, white has a slight advantage. Next move of the game is knight at b to d7 by black, developing pieces. Knight to c3, bishop to b4. Now white does not want to allow the exchange at c3, and this would double his pawns and therefore would lose his advantage of the central pawn majority in the center. So white plays knight to b5, black retreats the bishop to a5, and now white plays bishop to a5. I'm sorry, bishop to a3. I can't get my numbers straight. This bishop controls this diagonal, which will make it difficult for black to castle. It's a very strong move. It forces black to make some extra moves in order to bring his king to safety. Next move is a6, attacking the knight. The knight does not want to be exchanged, so he goes to d4. Black plays bishop to b6, once again attacking the knight, and now knight to b3. White has found a good post for his knight. It doesn't have to worry about the exchange, and he's been able to maintain his pawn majority in the center. Black next plays c6, and now white plays d4. White gains space in the center with these two central pawns, and of course he's got his c pawn that could be advanced later in the game. Black plays a5. White castles. He's now completed his development. Black still has to castle and develop his knight at c8. Black plays a4, attacking that knight again. And white plays knight to c1. Now let's just go back one move, previous move here. The pawn's attacking the knight, and you have to make a decision. Where's the best square to retreat this knight to? In this position, white has two choices. He can bring this knight to c1 or d2. Once you decide, once you figure out which squares are available to your piece, you then have to ask yourself, from the square I'm retreating to, where can this knight advance to continue its play? So let's take a look. In the game, white played knight to c1, but let's take a look at his move knight to d2. At knight to d2, the knight is really playing a defensive role. He's defending this pawn at c4, which is good, and he would also be able to support a pawn advance to e4. But the knight's playing a defensive role. In the game, white had played his knight to after a4, knight to c1, which from here he can advance the knight to d3 and make it an offensive piece where he can then control these squares here. And it's a much more aggressively placed piece. So that's just a little thing you can look at when you have that decision. Where should I retreat my piece to? And from where, after I retreat that piece, where is it going to go from there? So I hope that helps a little bit. Let's get back to the game. White just played knight to c1, and black will play bishop to d8. And now you can see why black played the move c6 on move 13. He wants to bring this bishop to e7 to assist, to either exchange that bishop or to force the bishop, the white squared bishop I'm talking about here, to either exchange or move, so allowing black to castle. White's next move is knight to d3, making the knight back into play, a little more offensive piece. Bishop to e7, and white plays bishop takes e7, and now king takes e7. The black king is in a central location, which is good. It's a good plus for the endgame. Queens are off the board, a minor piece is off the board. So having your king uncastled in a position like this is really not a negative. It could actually be a positive, especially after more pieces are exchanged. You get more into an endgame type position where you might only have rooks, or maybe a rook and a minor piece or whatever. So this does not hurt black at all by having his king in the center. In fact, it's most probably, if you really look at the two kings and with the pieces on the board, black's king is better placed than white's king. Next move is c5, and this advance of the c pawn gives white three good outposts for his knights. He has b6, d6, and e5. Yes, he has allowed black the ability to drop a knight into d5, but overall he's gained three strong squares for his pieces, but allowing only one good strong square for black. And of course black takes advantage of this, and he drops his knight into d5 on his next move. Next is knight at f to e5, taking advantage of the ability to play his knight to e5, a good strong square for the knight. Now black plays knight to c3. First off, you can see that this knight is attacking the e2 pawn, but more importantly, his plan really is to drop this knight to b5 so it can defend the d6 square. So it's a multi-purpose move. White must defend his e pawn, and he does so by bringing his bishop to f3. Next is f6. Black doesn't want to have this knight in the central part of the board, so he advances his f pawn, forcing the knight to move, and the knight drops back to c4, and now it's going to be eyeing the d6 and b6 squares. Next is knight to b5. The knight, like I said earlier, now helps control the d6 square. White plays e3, supporting his d pawn. Black plays king to d8. Rook at f to c1. Next is a3, and now bishop to g2. Black plays king to c7, and what he's done is he's really moved his knight into, his king into position where he would be able to help defend these two central squares if white should drop a piece in there, or one of his knights in there, that black might be able to maneuver his knights around and make the exchange and use his king to help with the exchanges at those two squares. White next move is f4. Black plays f5. Now by advancing this pawn, of course, he's now allowed the e5 square to become open again for one of white's knights. Next is rook at a to b1, knight to f6. The knight eyes the e4 square. White plays knight to b6. It's a good outpost for the knight. And black plays rook to a6. And from here, black is actually threatening to win a pawn because he can now bring this knight to d7 and make an exchange at b6. Of course, white wouldn't allow that. Of course, he'd most likely just make the exchange at d7 and then just live with his ability to put his knight at e5, or even after there he can bring it back to c4 and then go back to d6 or b5. But anyway, it's still a threat, and white must contend with it, and white does so by playing, after the move rook to a6, he plays knight to b4, attacking the rook at a6. The rook moves to a5. Next is rook to b3, and now black plays bishop to d7, finally getting his bishop off of its original square. White plays knight to d3 and rook to d8. Finally, black has all of his pieces that have moved off the original squares, and he's made them active. He does have a weak, or not weak, I guess you call it weak, a bad bishop at d7. It's blocked in by its pawns. Black would love to exchange this bishop, but with the pieces as they are right now, it's going to be very difficult for the bishop to exchange. In fact, it would be impossible for the bishop to exchange itself for any of white's knights, because white's knights will be moving around on the dark squares. For example, here at b6, e5, or d6. The only way he can exchange his bishop is if he could possibly somehow line it up against this g2 bishop of white, and of course that would take a lot of maneuvering to do so. The next move in the game is knight to e5 by white. Now both of white's knights are very well posted, very centrally posted. They're in black's end of the board. White has a very nice space advantage. Next move is bishop to e8, and of course black didn't retreat this bishop because he didn't want to exchange it. He would love to have white take the bishop, but he has different ideas with the bishop. He's hoping he can maybe possibly move up his pawns on the king side, and then by doing so activate the bishop more, get it outside of the pawn chain, and then possibly ultimately exchange it for the bishop at g2. White plays h3, next is h5, then king to f2, bringing his king up to help with his piece play. Black plays rook to a6. Now white plays bishop to f3 and rook to a5. And when you see a player kind of shuffling his pieces from, for example, in this game from a6 to a5, it pretty well gives you an indication that the player cannot find a good move. He really doesn't have any way to improve his pieces. Everything's tied up, and that's a good signal to take a moment to try to find the best and strongest move for yourself. You know your opponent's out of counterplay, and now it's up to you to find the strongest move, take advantage of your position. And in this position here, white has a large space advantage, controls many central squares with his pawns and knights, and now really it's time for him to open the game up for his rooks. So after black played rook to a5, white's next move is rook to g1. He wants to open up the king side for his rook to take advantage of his space advantage. Black is very cramped. And another good point about this, white really has no more play on the queen side. He has to move to the king side to open the game up. Black has done a good job defensively tying up white's pieces on the queen side, so he's forced to move his play to the king side. Next is g6, g4, h takes g4, h takes g4, and now f takes g4. And white recaptures with his knight at g4. Black plays knight to g4, and now rook to g4. Very quickly, white has advanced his pawns, made a series of exchanges, and he now has an open file for his rook. It's the h file, but This rook also, with the assistance of his light squared bishop, is going to win this pawn eventually. Black must defend it, and he plays bishop to f7. And now white plays knight to c4, bringing his well-posted knight from the queen side to the king side. Black plays rook to a4, and at this point black decided he really had enough. He knows that white's going to win those two king side pawns, and he will lose the game. So at this point black resigned. White would have played rook to e5, and then brought his bishop up, and the only piece that really black could bring over to help defend would be his rook. White would have 3 attackers versus 2 defenders. Pawn would fall. Once that pawn would fall, the next pawn would be this pawn, and with white's central pawn majority, he would be able to push those pawns forward and queen and win the game. And there again, it shows that very early on black had made that exchange I talked about earlier. He exchanged that d pawn for that b pawn, giving up white the central pawn control and pawn majority, and this led in effect to white's superiority in space in the center, and in the endgame had the majority of pawns also in the center. Hope you enjoyed the game. It was a very good game, I thought. Mikhail Botvinnik at this time was the strongest player in the world. I believe he was world champion at this time, or was very close to it. And what I like about this game is that you're able to look at Botvinnik, who is, like I said, is the strongest player in the world at this time, but he was playing also a very good, strong grandmaster from Hungary, and you can see very easily how this game progressed, and he was able to slowly but surely improve his position. And that's what's good about looking at a world champion versus another strong master versus 2 world champions fighting it out. You can see very easily how the stronger player slowly improves his position and wins. Sometimes when you watch 2 grandmasters play, you might see 40 moves and you really haven't seen any real strong advantage. There's a lot of maneuvering that sometimes is above an average player like myself, the concept of what's all going on. And that's why I like looking at world champions playing other strong players. It's much easier to see how they take advantage of the situation. Hope you enjoyed the game. I enjoyed bringing it to you, and until next time, thank you very much.